Welcome to the Sparked podcast, the show that will get you fired up about standards. On today's show, we have Daniel McCabe. Dan is the First Assistant Secretary, Medicare Benefits and Digital Health, Department of Health and Aged Care. By the end of this episode, you'll know all about why the federal government decided to invest in standards, what some of the learnings were from past attempts, and what the government's agenda is in moving standards forward in Australia. Let's get into it. Hi everyone, welcome to the Sparked podcast. I've got Daniel McCabe here, First Assistant Secretary in DOHAC, Department of Health and Aged Care, who's deeply involved in the digital health space. Daniel, tell me about the context of Sparked. What's been the government's role in this as a FHIR accelerator, and what's the government trying to achieve with it?
Thank you for having me on this podcast. I'll probably just start back a little bit to say I've been really fortunate to be leading the Commonwealth's policy for digital health for the last 5 years. And I think during that time, we've really had to look at some of the good things that work in our health system and some of the challenges that consumers and healthcare providers have in terms of navigating our system and also getting access to information and meaningful data to support patients. And I think that just recognises the federated health system. But we have a government and a minister that understands the importance of digital health and has looked at this as a really important opportunity to really uplift and transform the Australian healthcare system. And so if I think back to 2022, I was fortunate to spend a bit of time with Graham Grieve, for those that don't know, the father of FHIR, really just trying to understand what other countries had been doing using FHIR in their health systems to really make sure that they could unlock the potential of data in their respective health systems and what that might mean for both clinicians, consumers, but the system at large. So we sort of thought about that in the context of the Australian system and thought, well, this is a standard that was invented by Australia but has not really been recognised or used in Australia. And so we needed to do something to really look at how we could uplift our digital health implementations. We're sort of 10 to 15 years behind many comparable countries in this space. We're making multiple interventions, but getting nationally consistent standards for how data is collected, stored and shared in the health system was critical. Listening to Graham and the way that the use of community development was used around other parts of the world resonated very strongly with us in the department and myself specifically. And so we recommended to government that we needed to do this work. We needed to get broad engagement with industry, with clinicians and with consumers, and that we could do this without government sort of sitting in the front seat, but actually doing this as a ground up approach. So that's why we supported and work with government to fund the Spark program, which is really sort of setting the foundations about how we're going to transform healthcare through digital going into the future.
Reflecting on that intention to progress and catch up with many other places in the world, what does success look like at the end of this, if there is an end?
This is a long-term journey and we're going to have to look at this in stages. But for us, getting broad buy-in and recognising the importance of data for patients and consumers as they work in the health system and making sure we get that consistently captured, bringing clinicians on that journey and then thinking about the whole system point of view is sort of the core foundations of what we're trying to do. But I guess in the immediate term, we're trying to solve some of the fundamental challenges, some of the basic things that we can't do very well in our health system today, which is how do we make sure that when a person interacts with the health system, that interaction is captured in a consistent way, especially if a person has to move between care settings. So, for example, someone that might be in a hospital setting that needs care back in the community, we need to make sure we have a minimum set of information that is nationally consistent, along with a care plan for that person. The same as a person that has been cared for by a GP that might be moving into aged care or being referred to a specialist. It's really critical that we have a nationally consistent way of how we capture those encounters and make sure that core information for that interaction is accessible by the consumer, but also by their broader care team. So this is really, for us, it's our first sort of tenet of success, but then successes will be multifaceted once we get through that in terms of what we can do more broadly in the health system around looking at new therapies, medical research, getting much richer data for planning purposes are all sort of part of our longer term objective. But I guess for me, making sure that the patient's in the centre and giving patients much more consistency and agency in their healthcare is what we're going to try to do in the short term.
And now it's time for a fun fact from Kate.
CSIRO's Australian eHealth Research Centre is the Sparked Community Coordinator. We work in partnership with the Department of Health and Aged Care, the Australian Digital Health Agency and HL7 Australia to develop standards to enable secure data sharing capabilities across Australia's health system.
You know, we've seen examples internationally where legislation or regulatory changes have tried to support data interoperability. In the US, the 21st Cures Act had a big influence on data blocking and the adoption of APIs. Is that in your thinking in Australia?
I think it is. And I think we have looked to the US to learn a lot from what they've done there. And I mean, I don't often say that the US is a leader in a lot of things in healthcare, but I think in this space, this is an area that we can learn a lot from. I think the difference for us is that we're late to the party, but actually being late has actually been really useful because we can learn the lessons of not only the US, but other countries in Europe in how we do this. And the way that we're thinking about this, Brett, is we think it's really critical that we get the community process of developing these standards well entrenched, getting really good, strong buy-in from industry, from clinicians and from consumers. And that is underway. And I think that's the subtlety with the US. They really focused on putting laws in place to stop information blocking before they thought about how that data was going to be captured and shared. And so they ended up having challenges of garbage data moving between care settings, which actually didn't really further their cause. We want to sequence this so that we get broad buy-in and support for getting these standards developed. But we will regulate in due course, working with government on mandating the use of these standards. We want to make sure that we continue the positive buy-in, but we set the bar at some point in time. We also need to do things around privacy and security as well. And I guess more broadly, we're supporting government at the moment with some legislative change to start mandating mandatory sharing of, with consumer consent, information into our national My Health record system. So we are taking a layered approach to this. And so we will do similar things to the US, but probably just in a different sequence.
And with that sequencing in mind and the layering, how will it look for clinicians and industry? Does it become a much smoother pathway? Do they barely notice, or how might they reflect on it?
I think that's a very good question. Firstly, for industry, there's a huge amount of opportunity here. I mean, many of the companies I've spoken to would like to work in other markets, especially in our region, and actually using and having these standards built into their software will give them a much broader market to work within. I think in doing that, though, they have to modernise a lot of the technology that supports healthcare to enable this transition. And in doing that, be very cognizant of the workflows that clinicians have to use in delivering healthcare as well, and really try to make sure that that workflow and that redesign is done with clinicians as well to make sure that they get the benefit of it. Hopefully, in one sense, the changes around the standards implementation will be invisible, but in another sense, I think we want to work with clinicians to give them confidence that actually now you can depend on information from other parts of the system, from other clinicians in other settings, because we've got much more national consistency. Today, we have a huge amount of duplication of tests, for example, because for various reasons. One, because they can't find an original or previous relevant test, but often the way that data is captured doesn't help a different clinician, and they want it captured differently and presented differently. And so part of the work we've got to do is to get everyone using similar standards so we can move past those models.
And therefore, what does it mean for maybe industry in particular, but also clinicians not to be involved in the Spark community? What are they missing out on if they don't dive into the space?
For industry, I think there's a big risk of not getting engaged because, one, you don't get to have your voice heard and bring your expertise to bear into the community discussions. And I'd say, as I said earlier, industry has been very positively engaged. I think we're now up to 800 people and in companies involved in Spark, so that's massive. But I think that would be the first point, that they get their voice heard. But as I said, we will move at a point in time to regulate the use of these standards. And if you haven't been on the path, then you're going to get left behind if you don't move quickly to implement these standards as well. So I think that's broadly recognised and supported by industry, that it's critical for them to engage. For clinicians, I think, to my earlier point, that we have to make sure, and the same for consumers, that we don't just design things in standards in a vacuum of clinical practice or what consumers might need to understand their healthcare. We need that expertise in the conversations as well. We, as a community, have a lot of work to do to then sell the benefits to the wider professional clinical workforce and ultimately to Australians as well. But getting clinicians and consumer groups involved from the ground is going to set us up well for success into the future.
But it's not our first foray into standards by any means in Australia. What's worked poorly in the past, or what are the lessons learned? What's worked well in the past that we're carrying forward?
Often in the past, we've done things with a single program in mind. In the digital health space, the Commonwealth did a lot of work on My Health Record, but didn't really sort of think more broadly about the private market, states and territories. What we're trying to do now is make sure that we've got everyone's voice included in these conversations. But also, I think in the past, we've made all of these things optional. So we sort of say, well, it would be good if everyone did this. Please come and join us. I think we've put pretty strong signals out into the market and community more broadly that this is something that we want to do, something we want to mandate. But we want to make sure in doing that we give everyone a reasonable period to collaborate and bring their expertise to bear. That is the big difference, that creating community has been really powerful for us, but signalling that this will move from something that is optional to something that will become mandatory at a point in time, I think will be a big change.
And do you think that makes Sparked really unique in the policy development space?
I think we've been very fortunate. As I said, government is not leading Sparked. I mean, yes, the CSIRO is driving this on behalf of all of the government entities, but we're doing it with industry, with clinicians and with consumers involved. I think that makes a huge difference. But we do have policy agendas that we need to pursue as well. We're acutely aware of some of the challenges Australia faces with things like chronic conditions. 1 in 2 people have one or more chronic conditions. We are going to use the community to help solve some of those problems from a digital perspective as well. But actually having those conversations about some of the problems that we have in healthcare and looking at how we can use this program as a way to help enable solutions, I think has been very powerful.
Yeah, I think the Cures Act saw much more data sharing and data visibility through the NIH institutions. I think the research community's probably got good reason to start to get excited about what the prospects are for diving into research opportunities here as well.
I think a lot of the work we're doing now is foundational, and that will have some really powerful benefits for point of care for consumers, but actually the value in all of this work is much longer term as well, in terms of being able to get better insights into system planning, being able to really inform and support clinical trials, medical research, I think is the sort of where we want to get to. And actually allowing that innovation to then foster and really build its own momentum on the back of the work that the Spark program has done, I think is where we want to go.
Fantastic. We appreciate your time, Daniel.
No worries, Brett. Thank you.
The Spark podcast is brought to you by the Australian Federal Department of Health and Aged Care, CSIRO's Australian eHealth Research Centre, HL7 Australia, and the Australian Digital Health Agency. You can join the community by heading to sparked.csiro.au. And don't forget to join us on LinkedIn at SparkedAU. This show is hosted by me, Brett Sutton, Director of Health and Biosecurity at CSIRO, and produced by Ed Studios' Janine Hamer and Lucy Ratz, and CSIRO's Dr. Naomi Stecklenburg. Sound by Hayley Dell.